Hello again. I'm going to continue with a series that we've been doing looking at biblical characters. Today we're going to be looking at the fourth of these. We've looked so far at Deborah, as we learned, a woman of God and a prophet who led Israel. Samson, headstrong and yet an instrument of God's will. And then Samuel, whose life was dedicated to hearing God and serving him, doing as God asked. Today we're going to be looking at Abigail. The main account of Abigail we can find in the book of 1 Samuel and chapter 25. In our society, where there is a more rounded view of equality between men and women, it can be hard to understand the social situation among the Israelites and their attitude to women and to wives. Men, it seems, were very much in charge, and wives were expected to do as required and keep in their place, subservient to their husbands. I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from 1 Samuel 25. First is verses 4 to 11, and I'm going to follow that by looking at verses 8 to 20 before we continue. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. While your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore be favourable toward my men. Since we come at a festive time, please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them.' When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name. Then they waited. Nabal answered David's servants, 'Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I've slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?' Then a little later on in the same chapter, starting at verse 18, Abigail acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 sheaves of roasted grain, and 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, 'Go ahead, I'll follow you.' But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met him. What we see in this account is that there are 3 key players. David, a fugitive with his men. Nabal, a very wealthy man with servants and a wife. And Abigail, the wife. David comes over as authoritative. He's been protecting Nabal's flocks and shepherds, and clearly expected some repayment for that service. It does look a little at first glance like a protection racket. It would seem there was no actual agreement to protect the flocks with Nabal. But David's anger rises at Nabal's reaction, and he determines to take vengeance. Maybe because he had to show his troops that they had not wasted their time protecting all these flocks. Then there is Nabal, who, even if we ignore the opening comment in this chapter that he was surly and mean, clearly is not one to be intimidated by someone he considered a deserter from his master. Abigail's summation, that his name means fool, appears probably to be right. He did not consider the consequence of antagonizing someone with 600 troops, in fact being plain rude to them. Thirdly, we have Abigail. And it may be the writer's intent to give her a positive spin, but she is introduced as intelligent and beautiful, her name meaning my father's joy. Abigail is a clear contrast to both Nabal and David. And the account raises some interesting things for us to take on board. So here's my first thought then, sensible action. Hearing of Nabal's response to David's request, Abigail realised at once the danger they were all in. We don't know what she knew of David and his character, but 600 outlaws under a well-known leader may have had some impact on her. She could have been frozen in fear. Others would have been. Maybe others would have arranged a rapid trip to visit friends or relatives far away. What is clear is that Nabal's servants are so concerned that they turn to Abigail looking for a way to change the situation. They, it seems, had also realised how serious this was and how offended David would be. Disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household, they say. Abigail considered the situation, and she took immediate and sensible action. This threat to them all needed to be averted. A rude and proud, even foolish husband and a well-known leader of outlaws who had been offended. She did not go looking for her husband's approval. That would usually have been expected. She knew that was not going to happen, so she acted without it, packing up animals with goodies, a serious sweetener to deflect David from a rash course of action. On the one hand, we have two men acting, as we can see, quite rashly, both perhaps with a sense of indignation. Nabal not wanting to give anything away to an outlaw, not wanting to share his wealth with David. David, who on the other hand needed to feed his troops, all 600 of them, and had hoped Nabal would provide for them. David, angry and rash, determined to wipe out Nabal and his people and so take everything. Paul reminds us, referring to the words of Deuteronomy 32:35, that it's God's right to avenge wrong. In Romans 12:19 he says, "Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it's written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord." It often takes people prepared to go against the norm to change things for the better. Abigail took sensible action to avert the confrontation of these two men, to change the situation for the better. Many of you will have read the story of Jackie Pullinger, who, having arrived in Hong Kong, determined to take action to change things in the walled city, a place of depravity and drugs. She determined to listen to God, work in that community and make a difference when many thought it was impossible. Some of you will know of Martin Luther, who helped stand against the excesses of the established church in the 16th century. His efforts helped to bring what we call the Reformation, people standing up for what they believed was right. God, it seems to me, often calls people to take action in the face of injustice, violence, poverty, and other things. We're going to pause for a little while here, and you may want to consider this thought. If you're someone to talk with, it will be easier, but otherwise just consider. Share any stories you recall of people taking action to stand up against injustice, violence or poverty. Let me repeat that. Share any stories you recall of people taking action to stand up against injustice, violence or poverty. We're going to continue with my second thought, which is entitled Humility. Another aspect of this story which brings another contrast, I think, is that of humility. We read of David acting in a strong and forceful leadership style against the insult offered by the proud, rude and foolish Nabal. Clearly this would have led to neither backing down, and David would have wreaked vengeance on Nabal and his household. Acting in haste is a trait of many. Proverbs 21:5 tells us, "The plans of the diligent lead to profit, as surely as haste leads to poverty." And Jesus warns us of ill-considered actions in his little parable, which we read in Luke 14, starting at verse 31. Suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. The point being that rash action can result in even worse consequences. Abigail's humility is shown in that not only does she try to provide a peace offering to David, a bit like the king who realizes he's not strong enough to overcome his enemy and so seeks terms for peace, but she also humbles herself before him. Note that she has done nothing against David and his men, but in verse 24 we read, "She fell at his feet and said, 'My Lord, let the blame be on me alone. Please let your servant speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say.'" It's an incredible act of humility. She was the wife of a wealthy and powerful man. She would have had high status in her household and in the community. And there she was, humbling herself before this outlaw leader. She took the blame for something that was not her fault. There are echoes here, I think, of Jesus, who, as we are told in Philippians 2, verses 6 to 8, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Jesus' humility and ability to take the blame for all of humanity's sin made it possible for reconciliation between us and God. Abigail's humility deflected David's anger. I'm going to pause again now, and I'll let you have a chance if you want to ask yourself this question and see what answers you might come up with. What can we learn from Abigail and Jesus about humility? Let me repeat that. What can we learn from Abigail and Jesus about humility? I'm going to continue with my third thought here, an intelligent challenge. There's a third thing that I think is worth note in Abigail's actions. During packing up donkeys with food and wine and then travelling to meet David, she seems to have been coming up with a way to challenge David's actions, while not making the situation worse than it was. We're told that she was beautiful and intelligent. Perhaps both played a part in swaying David from his path. But look at the argument she used. "My husband is a fool. Let God deal with him." So she brings God into the argument. "The Lord has kept you from taking your own vengeance." In effect, God has prevented you from sinning. "May all who wish you harm be treated as God will treat Nabal. God will protect you," she was saying. "And God will deal with Nabal. Accept these gifts and give them to your men. Make the troops happy. Forgive my offence against you." She asks his forgiveness. "God will make a lasting dynasty for you because he fights your battles." A little bit of preening, making him feel better. God will raise you up. God is on your side. And then he will make you king over Israel. So she reminds David that kingship is coming. Maybe kings should behave in a better way than he is planning. And then finally, you would not want needless bloodshed on your conscience. A plea to his better side. She's saying it will stain your future, and you wouldn't want that, would you? I believe it was clever. It was intelligent. It hit the main points of the situation, and it enfolded the truth in a sort of feathering stroking of David while amplifying God's work in the situation. What's more, it worked. David was stopped in his tracks. He saw God's hand in sending Abigail. She was clearly God's instrument, and he asked God's blessing upon her. Later we're told God struck Nabal and he died. Later still, David, perhaps recognizing an amazing woman in Abigail, asked her to marry him. A woman of great character, humility and intelligence. And as I was concluding this, it led me to Proverbs 31:10, which talks about a wife of noble character who can find. She's worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. It seems an almost throwaway account, and we don't hear much more of Abigail, but I think it teaches us so much about behaving well in difficult and potentially crucial situations. Abigail shows integrity, humility, intelligence in her actions. Things, I think, for all of us to consider in whatever situations we face now or in the future. Amen.